welcome to today's event. My name is Koray Kamgoz. I'm the Director of Communications and Marketing at the PRCA. And welcome to today's event on bridging the climate intent to action gap. We're very pleased to have you with us. So for today's event, we've got a brilliant panel of guests who I'll introduce in just a moment's time. Just a quick bit of housekeeping before we get started. This session is being recorded. So if you are posing any questions or want to get would like to share this with any of your colleagues, please do bear that in mind. Please do use the Q&A function at the bottom. We'd love this session to be as interactive as possible. Please do use the Q&A function rather than the chat. It allows us to tick off the questions as we go along. We may integrate those with the discussions depending on the nature of the questions. And yeah, other than that, we hope you enjoyed the session. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce our two panelists and our host for today. So we have Paul Haines, who's Head of UK Media Relations at Ørsted, and Lucy von Sturmer, who's joining us in Amsterdam, as she is the founder of Creatives for Climate. And I'm delighted to hand over to today's host, Rebecca Zeitlin, who is a member of our PRCA Climate Misinformation Strategy Group, and she is the Marketing Director at Levidian. So Rebecca, I will hand over to you.
Great, thanks Koray, and welcome everyone. I'm delighted to have Lucy and Paul with us today to talk about this pretty important topic. Now, the headline for this event is Bridging the Intent to Action Gap. I think that could mean a lot of things to a lot of different people, and I'm expecting that we will cover quite a bit of ground in today's conversation. And just to echo what Koray said, please do use the Q&A function, because we want to make sure we're talking about the things that matter to you guys and not just the things that the three of us want to talk about. But before we get into the conversation, I'd really like Lucy and Paul each to introduce their organizations and why they're relevant, because I think that you both have quite an interesting perspective on this, particularly the action point. So Lucy, shall we start with you and introduce Creatives for Climate?
Yeah, sure. So Creatives for Climate is a nonprofit that I've actually been running as a project for 3 years. So we became a nonprofit foundation in May. My business is the humble brag. So actually I run a small thought leadership agency for leaders to be braver in how they position themselves. So reputation building, very familiar to you all here. I started that 5 years ago. And basically what I was looking for, I mean, we all want to drive the change through the brands we work with, through the businesses we work with. But like, let's be honest, like no single company is going to solve the climate crisis. And also none of us, although we may sell ourselves as foolproof experts, and I certainly do through my consultancy and my agency, we're all learning. And so it's like, in all honesty, I think I'm more of a climate activist first and a business person second. So I was looking for a community to learn from, to challenge myself, and to take action. And so we've really grown as a response to a need for many communications professionals, but also sustainability experts, lots of different hats that we're wearing to kind of like take action in this space. And so who we are, and after 3 years of really grassroots organization and just taking action, we've supported Fossil Free Nederland with their call to ban fossil fuel advertising in the Netherlands. We recently did a pro bono campaign supporting Greenpeace with their efforts to ban fossil fuel advertising, and we're amplifying a lot of other players in this space, Clean Creatives, Comms, Declare Purpose, Disruptors, etc. We are a community for communications professionals to learn from each other, to have a safe space to ask anything like, am I greenwashing? Is this impact? What are my blind spots? I think also with the intersectional nature of all the challenges that we face, it's really important to be vulnerable. And we've just launched our first training called Greenwash Watch. So it's by professionals in our community for professionals. And basically the idea is that we will take a cohort through a step-by-step framework to understand what a credible climate communication strategy looks like, but particularly with a lens towards calling out greenwashing. So that's why I think what we're doing is relevant. It's about new leadership, new voices, collaboration, and real change.
Well, on the subject of real change, Paul, can you introduce Ørsted to us?
Yeah, sure. So Ørsted is a Danish energy company. So it's been running for many years, but in the late 2000s. It was probably one of the most coal-intensive energy generators, power generators in Europe, and also had an expanding oil and gas business. But around 2012, took the decision to move to become a renewable generator, and entirely transformed its business model. I mean, I've only been with the company 2.5 years, so I can't claim any credit for any of that journey that they went on, or even the communications around it. But you know, having joined the company relatively recently, you know, to see and understand the journey that the business has been on to go from being an oil and gas company to now, you know, I think 4 years in a row now, voted the most sustainable energy company in the world, and with more offshore wind installed than any other company. You know, it's a pretty fundamental transformation, and a transformation that a lot of businesses are going to have to try and go through if we're to hit any of the targets that the government and in the UK are setting us.
So I think as a starting place, I think it's really interesting to put the two of you on a panel together, because this point about greenwashing and what constitutes greenwash and what constitutes a business bigging up, whether it's a small step, a medium-sized step, or a big step towards transition. How do we distinguish between those two things as communications professionals? How do we know that what an organization we look at is saying is legitimate and just being perhaps over promoted versus not legitimate and outright greenwash? So I don't know who wants to tackle that question first.
Yeah, it is really interesting being paired side by side. And so this is a conversation that comes up a lot, you know, like, do we just blanket cancel everything and go like, we need radical climate action now? Yes. You know, it's part of the reason I joined Extinction Rebellion. It's part of the reason that I'm like totally up for supporting civil disobedience. Like, we're in a climate emergency that, like, I'm no longer interested in profits for shareholders. Like, let's talk about survival. Let's talk about adaptation. So like, yes, there is a role to play in like really talking about what it means to take action. I think that, like, of course, you can't live and occupy that space and work and even like exist in society. So we need to hold space for also transitions and small wins. And so I get that. So it's a bit of a dichotomy, and I go between both. And I don't want to just like sit there and be like, not good enough, because I appreciate the work of sustainability consultants and people driving change. You know, I was in New York Climate Week last week, moderating a panel for my client that's got a multi-stakeholder initiative focused on Scope 3. And I appreciate how difficult that is, that it's so difficult for big companies to the traceability of their value chains, and then talking about how they're going to decarbonize and work together. At the same time, I'm not that interested in complex accounting systems for greenhouse gas emissions when, like, we know that we also need to be talking about degrowth. So I think we need to hold space for like what's the role of a company transitioning to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and drive positive action. But then also, like, should all these companies exist? Should we really be harnessing our efforts towards transitioning all these companies? What role do they play in the future? So I do occupy like both voices, one more of reason and one more of radical action. And I would just say that, like, I was talking to Carbon Market Watch 2 weeks ago about some of the litigation that they're pushing forward, challenging climate claims, carbon neutrality being one of them. And so I would argue that the term green energy, I'm not 100% sure how I feel about it, but I honestly don't know enough about the company. So maybe that's a good transition, Paul. Like, what does green energy mean for you? And is that something that you can truly stand behind the word green? Or is there something that we're not really seeing everything? Is it a part of your portfolio? Is it everything? I'd love to learn more.
Yeah, I mean, we are on track to be sort of carbon neutral for Scope 1 and Scope 2 in the next couple of years. As you said, Scope 3 is a more challenging ask. I think, you know, we're having gone from almost burning nothing but coal 10 or 15 years ago. We're due to shut down our last coal-fired station, I think, in 2025. So as I say, I think from our point of view, it's an interesting one, because when you're talking about transitioning, what we understand though is that we are and were a relatively small player as far as energy is concerned. There are much larger companies, much bigger ships to try and turn. And I think the point you make about should we even try to turn this is quite an interesting one. But I think from our point of view, what we're quite often asked is, particularly by journalists, is what rocks do you want to throw at BP, Shell, Total, Exxon? Pick your big oil and gas company. And I think from our point of view, if we are going to deliver a transition, we need those companies to deliver that transition. If taking the second part of the point you were making, if we keep those companies and they transition, because I'm not, if I'm honest, quite sure what the alternative looks like, and how that would be achieved. There are as we know, vast resources in those companies, both from skills and an experience point of view. If we're going to be delivering, from our point of view, offshore wind, onshore wind, those kinds of things, and particularly as we're looking at offshore wind going further out, floating technology, that kind of thing. That's something that the oil and gas industry has been doing for a long time. There's a lot of expertise there. Clearly from our point of view, in doing the wrong thing, but there are vast resources there. So from our point of view, it's more about we were the kind of canary in the coal mine, if you'll forgive the the analogy, that so that you can deliver offshore wind at huge scale whilst at the same time making a profit, because it was by no means clear that when we kicked off doing this in 2012 in a meaningful way, that you couldn't make any money doing it. And I think now that the big oil and gas companies are seeing that, well, what we're now seeing is a race to catch up effectively, and to take on more and more projects. It is still a very small percentage, clearly, of what those companies are doing, but that move is now happening, at least.
So for those of us who do the communications job, right? At the last couple of weeks and months, I've certainly seen an increase in the number of conversations around whether it's agencies being pretty aggressively criticized for work they're doing with clients. I mean, Paul, you mentioned Shell and Total. Those are the kinds of clients you see on these lists of, agencies, client lists that are attracting that criticism. For those of us who are within an organization or within an agency and who are doing communications, and who, Lucy, a bit like you, feel torn between a more radical divestment approach, a more radical, like, should the companies even exist, who feel the pressure of the emergency personally and morally in that way, but also, want to make things do stuff. We at the end of the day, we're communicators, right? We want to talk about something, and just saying turn everything off and not work with any of these companies is quite a hard decision for a lot of people to make. So for our audience today, how are you personally balancing those two things, Lucy, and how are you?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think about future generations, and I think there is no role for any communications agency to represent oil and gas firms. We are the myth builders and the storytellers of society. And I think that, I empathize with a lot of things that Paul is saying. He's saying we're a smaller player. We're doing better than the rest. I get that, and I see that. However, I think that we're in the storytelling business, right? So we need to make things sound sexy and maybe more advanced than they are. So that's why I'm I get the reality. And then I think there's the storytelling element that we can be held accountable for, which are the climate claims, like green. I think that's our responsibility. So I think one of the terms that we've come to accept in Creators for Climate is less bad. I would challenge a company to just say, be honest. Don't position yourself as a sustainability frontrunner. Help people understand what it means for you to hit your carbon neutrality claims? Are you buying offset projects? Are you changing your business model? I would say, like, I'm interested in how storytellers can be more transparent and be more honest, because I think that otherwise you are going to be, it's not like a reputation problem, it's a criminal problem. Like, we're really starting to see it. KLM's Fly Responsibly campaign is being sued for greenwashing. So that would be my response.
Now, Paul, when you and I spoke ahead of this call, we had an interesting little conversation about that transparency point as it relates to the media in particular. And we talked a little bit about kind of the challenges of communicating in what is essentially quite a crowded space, and also the expectations journalists may or may not have around what those claims are, what they ask you for. Can you kind of talk back through some of that? Because I think that really builds on Lucy's point about what, how do we define what we're doing? Is it good? Is it less bad? Is it green? Is it carbon neutral? Is my least net zero? I don't like the term net zero at all, because it can be meaningless. So, talk about your experience interacting with journalists a little.
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, what I would say is I 100% agree with what Lucy's saying in terms of, one of the things that we talked about is, I think that any industry, if they're trying to present a story about this and get away from journalistic cynicism, but also then the spread of disinformation and misinformation on the internet about what they're trying to do or what their industry is trying to do, you're only really, from a media perspective, as good as the worst player in your industry, because that's where the media will go. That's the story that they will focus on. And I used to see this. I worked at British Gas, and it was always in terms of that consumer, if you're talking about customer service, it was never the middle of ground in terms of the consumer stories that people were interested in. It was always the worst examples of things. But hey, that's journalism, that's the media. And I would say the same in terms of green claims. Nobody is helped by claims that are out there that are then provably, demonstrably BS, for want of a better word. And nobody is further forward. That company's reputation is damaged, and the industry's reputation is damaged as a whole. So I think, from our point of view, we've been looking very much at, sort of science-based targets, that kind of thing, where, we can actually, as close as anybody can, go back to this and say, look, this is showing out working effectively. This is the basis on which we claim that we are a clean, a sustainable company. If you don't agree, then at least you can see the methodology by which, we have reached that conclusion. And I think the more we can find, I think one of the issues we've got is around exactly as you were just saying, Rebecca, as well. Some people like net zero, some people don't. Some people, the phrases and the wording that people like. We don't really have I don't think, a commonly agreed lexicon on all of this stuff that everybody's comfortable with, and that is also a problem. Because if I say we're going to be net zero by somebody that comes along and says, well, net zero is all rubbish, we sort of end up being distracted by the terminology rather than what's the end game, what we're actually all trying to achieve here, which is to stop global warming, and prevent climate change.
I would agree with that. I listen to my clients stand up. So they're in the business of impact verification, and they said, like, we've got a crisis in trust in the term net zero. And it's like, we need to kind of find the balance between like tearing down the greenwashing, but also like, I don't want to see every company have their own North Star, like they're going to be regenerative and they're going to hit net zero. It's like, we need some common language. So yeah. And I mean, look, Paul, I'm not going to go light on you, but I also credit you for sitting up here today and being a part of this conversation. We need more people to be doing that. And I think that my feedback would be great work in being part of this transition. And I would change the comms a little bit. But Rebecca, I see some questions coming in. How do we navigate these? Do we just fire at them or?
I will have a look. We'll have a look through them and fit them in. But there was something in there that I kind of wanted to touch on, which is around how we as communicators educate ourselves as well. So there are a couple of things, whether it's the definitions of regenerative versus net zero versus carbon neutral versus whatever else. And also, how can we, who are not necessarily the generators of the information, verify the information within our own organizations before we're pressured to make a communications decision? A lot of us will have the challenge of not owning or even seeing, Paul, to your point, seeing the methodology behind those sustainable claims. A lot of organizations, those things are quite siloed away from comms. So what advice would you guys both give to people who are sitting there thinking, well, I want to do better, but now what? What's the challenge? What's the solution to that problem?
So hard. I mean, so hard. And that's why I built Creators for Climate. I have a background in sustainability, but I'm also a comms person. And I realize more and more people need that basic sustainability, level of education. Not only to push back on clients, we have this idea that communicators can just sit in a boardroom and be like, no, we know the politics and it's difficult. And so I don't think it's necessarily so that you're outspoken and you call out your clients. I think it's just so that you know yourself. That's what I see. I see a lot of people wanting to do good and getting really excited about green briefs. And it's more so my mission is that they can just navigate for themselves. Do I really think this is pushing the dial? I think especially when you're an independent, do I really want to spend my time on this message? So there is a level of reskilling. I've dropped the link to our peer-to-peer NGO course, which everybody should do because it answers this entirely. But yeah, I think it's really difficult, but there is 100% just a level of education that everyone is having to go through right now to get familiar with certain standards. I would also say don't get intimidated by the jargon. If something doesn't feel right in your gut, then just ask dumb questions, because we are jargon is a tactic of delay. It is a weapon to keep certain, roadmaps in certain conversations. And that's why I think transparency is also a very empowering tool. And I would love to see more companies using really simple human normal language so that Joe Blogs down the street also understands what you're working towards. So I would say basically try and, educate yourself, participate in the Greenwash Watch. There's a lot of new tools coming out from a lot of different players. So it is the burden of responsibility you now have as a communicator, but also your job is to listen into what the ordinary person knows and thinks. So then don't be afraid to ask some silly questions and just try and use really simple language so that you can be a translator. I think that's the biggest kind of gift we can give.
I think I would agree with all of that. I think certainly somebody sitting within a business perhaps has more license to challenge, maybe. I think if the comms function is being valued in the correct way, then it is perfectly acceptable to raise a hand and say, well, hang on a minute. I understand that there are bottom line ramifications to doing this or not doing this, whatever it is. But I'm here to tell you reputationally what this will do to your business. Now, it's also something I've learned over many years is that advice may well get ignored. But our job as communicators is to give advice about how any decision will land. And as I say, but what we cannot do is then say, well, that's fine, but we can't take £200 million off the table based on a bit of bad publicity, which I also understand. There's a commercial reality that drives a business. Most businesses are there alongside any other purpose they have to make money. Otherwise, they're obviously not there very long. But as I say, the organisations that I've worked in have, generally speaking, we've not always been successful in those challenges, but they've always been willing to hear them. And to take advice from professionals about the communications environment within which this is going to land, particularly as in energy at the moment, particularly, I'm speaking about the energy sector. It's pretty febrile at the moment from a media point of view. So, people are extremely willing to listen to what we've got to say in terms of decision making.
In answering Kath's, I just wanted to echo that as an activist, it's a really, like, coming in with a PR lens and a reputational lens is a fantastic way to bring in some of those ideas, because as you say, Paul, like, you're there to kind of like play devil's advocate. And again, like, yeah, if the client's like paying for your time and they actually want to land a message, but in a way that isn't going to see them in the news for the wrong way, I think that, like, it's a really powerful way to bring in some of those ideas. Sorry, Rebecca, back to you.
That's right. I was just going to take that thread and turn it in a slightly more extreme negative direction. So one of the questions we've had takes that to the end point, which is, if you can't make change, whether you're in an agency and you're being told to work on a client you are morally uncomfortable with, or you're in an organization, maybe you're in an oil and gas company and you feel like the organization is not actually making real change, perhaps, and you're not the person that people are listening to for whatever reason, what do you do? Do you leave? At what point do you say, all right, I'm done, I abandon this? Is that a real choice that communicators have?
I think it's a personal choice, right? Like, it's situational. I was talking to a journalist last week that was gathering stories of individuals that were leaving agencies because they no longer agreed with the clients that they represented. But she was having trouble because it's always nuanced. People leave jobs for multiple reasons, and they were there for a certain amount of time because they were kind of okay with it. So maybe they, like, you know, had a bit more safety and security, or maybe a new opportunity. So I would say like it would be like inappropriate for me to tell anyone else what to do. But my mission is to let them know that there is so much work in this new economy space. Like, I've created another training program called Positioning for Purpose, because I want people to understand there is a competitive advantage to having these viewpoints and to being outspoken and to being brave. There are so many sustainability roles out there. I don't think that people need to think that they need to represent clients that they no longer believe in. This transition is happening. This new economy is booming. So, like, open your eyes, look out there, try and reposition yourself, upskill, be more like, you know, find your values-driven folk. And, you know, I've heard it a million times before, like, I'm a change maker from within, you know, I'm working with the devil's advocate because I'm like being able to shift and nudge things along internally, and they need that voice internally, 100%. But the moment you stop being that voice, maybe it's time to move on. And so, yeah, I mean, I empathize. I have bills to pay like everybody else, but there are ways to make money doing good. And again, like, we're communications professionals, so we should, especially with a reputational lens, like, we should be listened to. And I think you can be in a company that's not doing good, and that you can raise this point, and that you can truly have value, because people pay for dissenting voices. They need these insights. But I don't think there's any reason why you can't find a role that is in this new economy. So I don't think people have their hands tied, honestly.
Again, I completely agree with all of that, and I think the only thing I would add is that from a personal perspective, I've worked in companies where you sort of find your personal morality and the aims of the business not necessarily aligning. And all I would say is that actually, personally and professionally, that's a very, very draining place to be, when you're going into work every day thinking, you know, I'm almost having to kind of defend the indefensible here. And if you don't feel, as I say, that you are that change maker from within, you know, as Lucy was saying, as I say, I think just personally and professionally, all I would say is just keep an eye on that, because, you know, it can be, you can be kind of, I don't know whether that happens, yeah, that tipping point happens 6 months in, 12 months in, whenever it happens for you personally. But I think you will reach a point where you just think, I'm not sure I can do this anymore. And
I think that's the thing that, like, I don't have a lot of appetite for, is people being like, the system sucks, my job sucks, life sucks, everything's not gonna, you know, nothing's gonna go well. I hear that a lot. Like, people are just kind of like throwing in the tap. They're like, as if this doomsday scenario is kind of inevitable. And like, I don't have a lot of time for that. It's like, as Paul says, it's a really negative energy to hold physically, emotionally. It's a cynical way to live. And like, I have got so much joy from meeting other mad folk trying to do good. And so there's another way to be.
I'm going to come back to the cynicism point, actually, because we've had a question that I think touches on that really nicely. But before I do, I want to take this, when we think about like the interaction between agencies and clients, right? So not just employees within an agency or within a client, but as an agency, when you're evaluating a new client brief, what's the responsibility there for assessing the sustainability credentials of that client at that point? Paul, have you ever been asked to show any of that as part of a briefing process? I've been client side my entire career, and nobody has ever asked me for any of that kind of information at brief stage. So I'm really curious to hear, like, what for agencies, it's a reputational issue, it's an ethical issue, it's an employee comms issue. So what's the responsibility in that briefing process on the agency side?
Shall I go first on this one? Yeah.
Sure, go for it.
I think from my point of view, it's, I've worked client side quite a long time. I think it's something that now would be part of any briefing and certainly in pitching process as well. Even if you just said 2 or 3 years ago, I think it probably, I'm not sure it would have been in most, in the organizations that I've dealt with, certainly. But I think, as I say, now I think we want to understand that the organizations we're aligning with share our values, and that's going right through our value chain, whether it's, communications advisors or any other business that we're working with. But also, as I say, what we want is really strong challenge in terms of what we're doing, because from my point of view, the point of an agency, frankly, is to give us that external perspective, that eyes from outside critiquing what we're doing. And if they're not doing that, frankly, they're not much use to me because I read the papers, I understand that bit, but then I'm still bringing my own perspective as an insider in this company. So, I get the kind of media landscape and the context. What I don't get is necessarily how we are viewed and how what we're saying might land from that external perspective. So that outside in perspective is incredibly valuable to us.
Great question, Rebecca. And I know some agencies like Enviral, for example, they have kind of like a compass to assess new clients. I've run like a boutique agency, so I tend to just like fall in love with people or I don't, which is a terrible way to run a business. So I can tell you that where I've landed after 5 years of doing this, it's, I'm not a sustainability strategist. I'm not an impact strategist. So if you are, I really encourage you to work with different kinds of clients than I do. I'm a comms person. I do thought leadership. I do reputation. I am the arm piece that makes them sound cooler, better, smarter. So I will only work with ambitious sustainability organizations, so multi-stakeholder initiatives, with like working towards science-based targets. I will only work with NGOs, and I will only work with B Corps. And even some of the B Corps, I'm like, really? Is that just certification making you look good? So as a comms person, I'm pretty like strict with who I will represent. When I started my agency, not so much. Like this word purpose was kind of lofty, and it was like, well, they can be driving purpose in this way and that way and this way. And it's like, I know better now. My skill set's too important and too valuable to build up their reputations. So I'm like really excited about working with like genuine frontrunners. And I think you can broadly make that definition, and it doesn't have to be so complicated. B Corps, NGOs, and multi-stakeholder initiatives and ambitious sustainability organizations. That's my threshold. That's
super useful. And I think just to echo, Paul, a little bit what you said, when I engage in the agency for things, we use a values-based metric to evaluate who might be a good partner for us. So we're doing it on our side, even if the agency is not asking me for the same questions on their side. Because as you say, it's at the end of the day, you have to have that alignment if you want to get the good value out of that relationship. So I want to come back to cynicism, because I think cynicism is it's everywhere in the climate conversation, isn't it? And we've had a really great question about how dealing with skeptics is like just part of what we do, and dealing with that like deep ingrained negativity, like abandoning ship, like the world's on fire, we're just going to have to deal with it now. How do we tackle this section of society who's either already abandoned hope, or who are just so sick and tired of hearing about climate change and all of the, you know, down with oil and gas, and they're just tired of it? How do we talk to those people? How do we help bring them on the journey? You know,
Sure.
you know, it's the same thing with NIMBYism and onshore wind, Paul. I mean, it's that, like, how do we help people understand their role in this very complex and frankly exhausting discussion?
I have two responses to that. So one of them is that we don't. Those that have disengaged and are not going to be part of the solution are also not the majority. So where I'm interested in focusing my efforts is people that want to do good, but are very, very confused. And I'm heartened actually by the intelligence in the room and the critical thinking that's coming up more and more as people's comprehension of what credible corporate climate action looks like. So I'm interested in shifting that audience along. I think there are other people that are targeting those that are either in denial or resistant, but I'm not going to focus my energy there, because that's one of resistance, and that just doesn't work for me and what I believe and where the value that I think that I can bring in. The second one, though, is cynicism around being a change maker, being visible, being a diverse voice. And like, trust me, as a female entrepreneur and a kind of A-type personality, like, I've had my fair share of dealing with people and their opinions about that. But I actually had a pretty interesting conversation with Solitaire Townsend from Futerra last week. And she was like, I just don't pay attention. I know that I'm doing good. I mean, like, she's really the most, like, the kind of, you know, most prolific, famous person in this space, giving thought leadership on brand activism. And like, that's a pretty intense profile to hold, to be able to be so visible and be so outspoken and occupy that. Like, I'm really interested in how people are able to do that. And so she doesn't give any attention to this as cynicism, or at least that's what I was kind of relayed. And I was like, I guess you do have to be pretty laser focused on the work that you're doing and how connected you are to it and your mission, not to also become cynical about yourself. So I think there's kind of like, how do you address those that are cynical in society? And then how do you not become cynical? And like, obviously about my work to a degree, I have become cynical. And that's why I started Creators for Climate, and why I'm so like, you know, strict about who I will represent. But sometimes the cynicism is also good. Like, we need a little bit of pushback. We need critical thinking. So I have a kind of mixed response to that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the sector needs challenge, absolutely. I think that one of the things that we can do, and this is where again though that we tread the fine line between you know, up towards greenwashing, but you know, actually giving people reasons to believe there's hope. So, you know, showing progress, showing real examples of things that are happening. You know, the industry you're in, you know, hydrogen has been one of those areas where there's been a lot more talk than action for a long time. And so after a while, you know, certainly speaking to journalists about whatever kind of hydrogen, after a while they were just like, yeah, fine, but I just need to see actually a real project rather than one that might happen possibly at some point in the future. And I think that you can kind of cast that across the whole kind of, certainly in terms of energy, the whole gamut of things that are going on in the area. If there are real things that are moving forward and are good news, then I think, you know, as I said, that our role as communicators is to get them out there, but not get overexcited and, you know, tip over into overselling what these things are, because I think that point you only then feed the cynicism machine rather than give people reasons to be positive.
Yeah,
Stunned
I
everyone
think
to silence.
it's Not quite. I think it's certainly, that's my experience. We do a lot of work in hydrogen, so that space in particular is full of claims and discussions that have very little underneath them and wrapped around them, and that creates this kind of inherent distrust of everything that gets said, which, you know, that's perhaps a topic for a whole separate conversation around what kind of damage that's doing. But
I think the other thing as well, so all I was going to say is about picking your battles as well, because, you know, as an example, we, particularly on social media, you know, we all know social media can be a deeply wonderful place, but it can also be a complete morass as well. So, you know, it can be, again, this advisory role to go, because execs see stuff, particularly when they're tagged into things, and you know, senior board member, whoever it might, we need to reply to this, we need to reply to this, we need to reply to this, and it's stuff that's coming from people who clearly are never going to be convinced by us that, you know, what they're saying is incorrect. You know, they clearly don't believe in climate change, that, you know, we haven't even kind of got a base level of agreement that, you know, that climate change is happening and it's being caused by you know, it's man-made, and that there's actions we can take to try and ameliorate it or mitigate it. If you can't, you know, it's about where you place your energy, again, as a communicator. You know, that whole kind of thing, you cannot boil the ocean with this stuff. You've got to try and put your efforts where they're actually going to have some kind of resonance or impact, I think.
So that actually inadvertently leads beautifully onto the next question I want to ask, which is, how about the other end of the spectrum, right? So, you know, Lucy, you mentioned Extinction Rebellion, and I think we're seeing a lot more kind of radical end of the conversation on climate change, probably in the last 3 years. Maybe I'm getting that timeline a little wrong, but certainly that's how it seemed to me. So, you know, that's clearly the opposite end of the apathetic cynic who's saying, or even the complete denier, right? That's really different place to be. But how do we as communicators work with that end if we ourselves are perhaps not so radical? To use, you know, myself as a personal example, I'm in an energy transition space. So for me, the divestment of oil and gas, I really struggle to kind of hold that story in my head while also being realistic about how we transition while powering the universe we live in. So for me, I find that really hard, and I find engaging as a communicator with the radical space more challenging. So I'm curious what your experiences, Lucy, are of being the radical voice in a place that's perhaps less prone to thinking in that way, and also, you know, how do we bridge the gap and bring those two pieces together? Oh, you're muted. Sorry.
Sorry, I muted myself. Believe it or not. Just so I understand the phrasing of the question. So you find it difficult because you don't have all the answers about what a transition will look like? Why is it so difficult to buy into this narrative of divestment? Is it, and I hear that a lot, is it because you don't know what the alternative is, or just so I can understand?
Well, so it's partly that, it's partly also, you know, my own personal opinion of what the future is going to be and how we get there. But I think it's also the kind of strength of that radical conversation. I'm very much a gray area person in my own life. So for me, seeing things in a black and white way doesn't come very naturally. Right. And so having a conversation with somebody who is thinking more radically about how we address climate change, you know, I immediately feel a little bit defensive about that. Right. So how do we as communicators deal with that defensiveness and try and bridge the gap? And equally, how do we as corporate communicators accept input from a more radical viewpoint? How do we, and how have you found that conversation goes? You know, what kind of feedback do you get?
Yeah. So I think, like, I'm going to use the analogy of like what's happened with like Black Lives Matter and racism. Like, do you feel neutral and gray about like taking a position on that issue? And I would say, like, if you do, you probably aren't affected, and you're probably coming from like a little bit of a position of privilege. And so I would say that like, I completely understand that people have different personalities, and like I am a highly activated, highly engaged person. So it's not going to be like everyone's comfort zone to speak up or to challenge. And I totally respect that. But I also think that like we're so far beyond the appropriateness of I don't have a political view on this. Like every single company, look at the world that we're in. So if you're somebody that's choosing so-called neutrality, you're not.
So I want to challenge that a little bit, that gray doesn't mean neutral. So,
okay,
I think it's possible to believe we're in a climate emergency and also not believe the divestment of oil and gas today is the right approach, right? I think those two things can coexist. And I think that's a moral challenge that a lot of people deal with every day. But I think it's about, in a world where the black and white action is not necessarily well understood, how does that, we're talking about bridging the intent to action gap, right? So how do we as communicators bridge that gap when the action other people are perhaps expecting to see is,
well, I mean, I'm super curious, so I'm just someone that's like listening to that being like, tell me more, like, what does it look like not to divest and why not? And 100%, like I can empathize with, like, we can't just like no longer operate, and using oil and gas today. So like, what is that transition? I think my response is like, so interesting, educate me and let's have that conversation. So I think it's hard for me to like respond and be like, but I'm demanding this. I think that at the same time, you can demand something whilst not having all the solutions. And I think that a lot of climate action is stalled because people go like, we've seen it on the news, it's like, but you're wearing a dress and oil and gas goes into the production of dresses. And it's like, okay, like we can't just like live in that kind of polarity also on the other side. So I find that a really hard question to answer without knowing where you're coming from exactly, or like what an alternative looks like, but I'm super interested in. And I think that these are the conversations we need to be having, because if I can't understand like what the resistance is and what the alternative is, I can't get behind it, So I think that like, I'm going to blanket statement be like, there is a role for radical voices and radical demands. And I think that sometimes, like, I've worked in civil society for quite a long time. And so the role of activists is to be unreasonable. Like, it's not the job of activists to come with business solutions to problems. We need agitators, because if we don't have agitators, if we don't have Greenpeace calling out, if we don't have clean creatives calling out, companies will not be responding to find solutions that work here and now. And if everybody was so moderate and so reasonable, we'd see no change at all. So I think that, like, I used to be the head of communications for a multi-stakeholder initiative that arose as a response to a campaign from Greenpeace. And my boss used to be like, oh, they're so unreasonable. I was like, it's not their job to figure this out. It's their job to tell us what's going wrong. And so I would say that, like, we kind of need everybody, but also, like, let's not give ourselves a green pass.
Paul, I really want to hear your perspective, because I completely agree, Lucy, with that you have to shift what's normal, right? And to shift what's normal, you need things at the extreme edges, and the more extreme the edge, the more you shift the normal, right? So I think that's absolutely understood. I'm curious, Paul, how do you take that phase shift and integrate it into what you as a company are doing when you can't go all the way to the end point, right? That's not possible. But how do you then bring that feedback into the organization and help develop the steps that you can take?
I think one of the most important things that we can do is, so we've moved from a position, so taking it something like offshore wind. 10 or 15 years ago, everybody was like, offshore wind's absolutely not the answer. Now the government has decided offshore wind is the answer, and we should be building more of it. But what that does is then just shifts where the edges of the argument are, if you like, because now we've got a lot of people putting words into the industry's mouth, if you like, particularly again on social media, but also in some of the more right-leaning media, to say offshore wind is not the answer. It's got intermittency, and it's not the answer. We never said it was the answer on its own. So it's about people understanding, and us, I guess, being brave enough to have more of these conversations in public, and people understanding that nuance is not compromise. They're not the same thing. And, you know, understanding an argument and having more information can't be a bad thing. So again, using offshore wind as an example, we're moving from a phase in the industry where we were trying to convince everybody that offshore wind can be part of the answer. Government's now accepted that. We're building out loads and loads of offshore wind. The arguments around offshore wind are now moving to the impacts of offshore wind, much more so, because we're going to be building out more of it. So what are the impacts on marine environments? What are the impacts on local communities where we're building these things? What's the impacts on bird life? All of these things. But I think as an industry, we have to be brave enough to have those conversations and say, we haven't got all the answers. We've got some of them, and we've got a lot of experience in terms of building out offshore wind projects. But that doesn't mean to say we are going to suddenly go and wave a magic wand and the RSPB are going to say, yes, we're absolutely happy with everything you're going to do around birds, for example. Of course they're not. But we also have to, I think, as I said, be brave enough as an organisation, but also as an industry, to say we haven't got all the answers. How do we get to the right answers and have those debates in public?
And this conversation is evidence of that. Like, we all want the same thing. And I'm not sitting here being like, I'm a truer climate activist than you. Like, let's get over that. I see that a lot that happens at sustainability conferences where people like start to talk about their children and why they care more than other people. Like, nobody cares any less than somebody else. So we're all just trying to figure out, like, what does this transition look like? And so, like, I agree, like, we need to have part of the reason that, like, these disclosure campaigns are so powerful, and impact reports and B Corp and all these sorts of kind of like movers and levers in society, is that people are really afraid. And I was like, when Futera released their creative climate disclosure, I signed up to it. And it was basically, you had to declare where your client, like where your money came from, what kind of industries your clients were in. And some of my clients at the time were airlines, and I no longer represent them. And yes, I was involved in the KLM greenwashing campaign. And I was like, kind of like stifled, because I was like, are we really ready to do this? And so it's fantastic. Like, people need to be more imperfect in public because it drives internal change. And so don't get cynical about B Corp. Don't get cynical about clean creatives. Don't get cynical about any of these levers and drivers, because we all need to be supporting each other and figuring out, like, what are the pressure points, but then, like, what are the potential solutions? And I think that, like, this movement will die if people think that they're more heroic than others and they're not able to sit at a table. And I think that we need to hold space for that so urgently.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think if I had any criticism of campaigns that I see, it's the negativity towards practitioners that comes out of those campaigns. You know, we are all individuals, and the vast majority of people are not out to, like, get each other. Like, people aren't fundamentally evil most of the time, right? So I think it's important that while we are critical of a campaign, or we're critical of an approach, that the kind of personalized negativity that I think we sometimes see, that doesn't get anybody anything. But that I want to pick up on this theme in a slightly different way, which is, we are all sitting in Western nations, right, with governments that are making pretty clear regulatory and policy steps towards climate change, addressing climate change. Not everybody is sitting in that kind of country, right? So what about companies who are in nations with a weak or unclear government requirement or strategy towards sustainability? Do you guys perceive that those organizations are actually being authentic and moving their way forward, or do we need that rigorous regulatory framework to make this work?
I mean, we're sitting in, like, privileged nations, but boy, do we owe the rest of the world a debt. So actually, we're the polluters. So it really starts and stops with us. You know, we've seen it with Pakistan, like, I don't really know, like, and this is genuinely like a gap in my knowledge. I'm genuinely not aware of any kind of remedial action that the UK took. But then, you know, the week after that, they're kind of like paying tribute to the Queen and like mourning the Queen. So it's like, there are like global reparations that need to be made. one of my directors at Creators for Climate, because I am very much about new leadership and intersectionality, young women voices, people of color, Indigenous knowledge. She's based in Nairobi, and it's fascinating. Like, she's like, we don't have conversations about carbon emissions and net zero, but like, we know that like we can't grow food. And we know that like houses are being, you know, battered and flooding's a problem. So I think there's like a nuance in terms of the language. And to your point about like how much we can trust institutions and other countries and nations, I'm really just focused on where the power lies at the moment.
I think in specifically in the energy sector, I would say one of the conversation is there's a sort of a continuum where some countries are interested in becoming greener. Some countries are interested in the economic opportunities that might be unlocked from developing, whether it's offshore wind or solar power or anything else. So I think that there's a way, you know, it's almost the sort of either way around it, whatever the motivation is, you can get to the right endpoint. So, you know, I think that's certainly very active conversations are happening across the industry in terms of energy specifically, because, as I say, people do see either, you know, an opportunity for energy independence or an opportunity to become an exporter for, you know, because they've got fantastic solar resources or wind resources or whatever else it is, and you know what that can bring with it. So I think, as I say, there's probably ways around it, even if they're not particularly sympathetic to a green agenda, as it were.
I've just become aware of the time. It is 28 minutes past 11, and we have actually quite a few still really good questions. We've touched a little bit on some of them, but in the last minute, I'd be really grateful for you both to share kind of the bullet point takeaways, either from this conversation or just generally for this audience. You know, the quality of the questions has been outstanding. I think this is a pretty switched on group of people we're talking to. So what would you want to say to them? No guidance from me. Paul, why don't you go first? Because you're
I think what this has reinforced for me is the absolute importance of challenge, and to challenge yourself as an organization, that because I think it's very, very simple, particularly, you know, a company like Ørsted has, you know, it has changed itself. And I think that there can, not that it has, but there's a tendency to become possibly complacent or slightly kind of not as far along as holier than thou about it, but, you know, you can at least be satisfied with what you've achieved and kind of sort of you're resting on your hilltop, looking back at everybody else thinking, wow, we've come a long way. We've still got an enormous way to go, and we need criticism, constructive criticism from, you know, and this is where we're talking about, you know, I guess the more radical end of the spectrum, to keep us honest in terms of what we're doing and how we're communicating it. Because if we don't have that, I think in any organization there is I suppose entropy in a communication sense. You kind of you rest on your laurels. So yeah, it's just really, really reinforced for me that the need for external challenge, but also to continue to challenge yourselves about your messaging and be rigorous.
Yeah, I think, like, first of all, it's just so nice to be in a room, even though I haven't spoken to anyone else in this room. I've read the chat and the questions, and like, God, it's nice to be in a room full of smart strategic comms people, because you get it. We're in this together. So yeah, I mean, this is the work. And I guess I just want to, like, I do hear, as I get older, I'm becoming more reasonable. And I do hear the kind of wish and demand that people weren't being called out. I would also say, like, it's a burden of responsibility to be this dissenting voice. Like, it's very difficult to grow a business when you're like, we need radical degrowth, but like, I'm willing to be that person, because like, we need this voice. And I would encourage other people to, like, not outsource their dissenting voice, be the dissenting voice. Like, if that person isn't in the room, don't call me. Like, become that person. And if you do call me, like, make it easy, or people like, you know, like when you're inviting activists or people with that dissenting voice, like, this is labor. So like, recognize that, value it, and either take it on or yeah, provide the conditions for it to survive.
Fantastic. Well, the last thing I would ask both of you is, if people want to contact you with any further questions, one, is that okay? And two, how do they do that?
Absolutely fine from my point of view. I'll give you my email address, and people can contact me directly if they want to, which is pauha@Ørsted, which is ORSTED.com.
Yeah, and I mean, if people are keen to join a community of people that are willing to, I can see Lucy Bounce here, who's part of our community, which is awesome. And the Greenwash Watch starts in a week, so it should be fun. And yeah, thanks PRCA and John, who I know is a front runner in this space, for inviting me here today.
Thank you both for coming, and thank you everybody who attended and the outstanding questions. I hope I asked them all in the ways you were hoping for, and if not, you can find me on Twitter. I'm at RF Zeitlin, and you can shout at me all you like there, and I will do my best to answer questions as well if I can. Koray, any final words from you?
Perfect. No, just to say a massive thank you. We've run so many of these virtual webinars in the last couple of years, and honestly, I can't remember a discussion and a conversation as engaging, as inspiring as that one. So a huge thank you, Lucy, Paul, and Rebecca. Really grateful for your time. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this will be available online, so it'll be published on our YouTube channel. So if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, PRCA TV, you'll get a notification of it when it goes live. But yeah, other than that, just an enormous thank you, and a privilege to have you all with us today.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.